Hi, and welcome to the Girly Organist podcast. I'm Dr. Rebekah, and on this podcast, I will discuss and consider all aspects of being a feminine creative artist, academic, and musician. Today's episode is looking at the area of elitism. Now, if you are someone who knows me relatively well, or even doesn't know me relatively well, one of the words that's often used to describe me, Dr. Rebekah, is direct. And some of that, I think, is there is a general assumption in the north of the UK that people are direct, or they call a spade, and the polite way of saying that is to say someone is direct or to the point. And whilst in many cases that would be true, but sometimes I do indeed surprise myself. And on one occasion, I found myself whipping round mid-conversation and asking a colleague, "Are you elitist?" I don't think you can get much more direct than that. If I was to go back, I would definitely ask the question again, and I would ask it in the same way because I think it was the way that it required being asked at that point in time. However, it brought up an interesting conversation, and we're going to go down that conversation street a little bit today. The answer I received from this colleague was, yes, I am elitist because it ensures quality. I don't know what answer I expected to receive, but I remember thinking, curious, very curious. I then sat with this. This would be maybe 3 or 4 years ago, just before COVID perhaps. And I've sat with this idea of elitism, or what it is, on and off over my time training as a musician, being a musician, working in music, working in church music, working as an organist, moving from conservatoire to university, etc. It's come up again and again. And I think it comes up again and again because it's connected to our identity as artists, musicians, researchers, performers, composers, however we want to define ourselves. So I started to look back initially to my own music making as a young person. Now, when I was, first starting out as a musician, a young musician that didn't know anything, just liked to play an instrument, I was one of these Suzuki violin children of the 90s and early 2000s. And it was great. It was great. It didn't do much for my sight reading, that has to be said, but overall it was great. It wasn't elite, however. In fact, that idea of something being elite was never present. Not in my experience. And it was never present because the message that we all received, music is a level playing field. Nobody's better than anybody else. Anybody that wants to learn, this was a time when there was lots of funding for the arts, can have that opportunity and get started. And it's down to how hard you're willing to work. So the message wasn't, you can't be part of X, Y, and Z. It was, you do the work, the reward is being part of it. You don't do the work, you don't get to be part of it. And I would say lots of that still holds true today as an adult. There will always be people that will do the work. There'll always be people that coast, there'll be people that don't do the work. And I think as we go through life, we can dip in and out of where we are depending on the context of that as an idea. I then went to a private music boarding school, teaching school of music here in the UK, which other people often perceived as being elite. But the message that I took home was, you're here because you are good enough to be here, and you deserve to be here because you've put the work in to get here. It was never, you're here because parents can afford it, or you bought your way in, etc. Because that just didn't really work. So I would say it wasn't until I went to conservatoire at university level, so college, higher education if you're in the States, that I really came up against this idea of elitism, which is really curious. There are so many voices today talking about the nuance of conservatoire experience, and I think that there is lots of voices speaking out about things perhaps they never did or felt they could at the time, or maybe there wasn't space for them to. And so I think that it's important that that happens, that people can express. Some of it is cathartic, healing for them. Some of it is to, ignite change in some ways. I think I can't comment on that as an area too much because it wasn't my experience, or it's not experience that I particularly draw on going forwards. And I think for me, it's you take the best of what was and you move forwards, and that's me. I appreciate not everybody is like that or views things like that, but that's just how I navigate through those things. But this idea of elite or favourites was quite interesting, because the perception of me having been to a private music school was that I am one of the elite group within the cohort. However, I didn't really realise this until leaving that environment, because within my cohorts, I would have said, I could pick off the top 5 players in the conservatoire at that time, and I would say they are the next level. They are, not to say the rest of us aren't good, but there's just something really special about their playing. And I think those players today are, doing the rounds of concert halls and international tours, etc. And so I would say that wasn't necessarily exclusive to, that cohort isn't made up of people that only went to private music school. It very much involves who was doing what work at what time and how they positioned themselves. And some people caught on to that faster than others. Some people looked at elitism as a kind of a blame, but then the reality was actually these people were working really hard and networking, and and so that all contributes. I then moved to university, and I really enjoyed university, arguably far much more than I enjoyed being at conservatoire. And that was where I came across the idea of, if you're a musician, you're elite. to multi-instrumentalists. And to this day, I really do, it just makes me, when they talk about ick, I would say I have an ick of when people describe themselves as multi-instrumentalist. I'm like, no, what instrument do you play? But I think that is something that just goes back to my education growing up as a young musician, and what instrument do you play, because we don't play them all. You can dabble, but what is your trade? If you ask a building contractor what do, they will say, I'm a plumber, I'm an electrician, I'm a brickie. They will have their trade. And so for me, when someone says they're a multi-instrumentalist, I'm like, no, the question I'm asking you when I say, oh, what do you, are you a musician, what do you play? I want to know what your trade is, what your highest level on which instrument is. I'm not interested that you can play 10 other instruments. I can play violin, piano and organ, but if you ask me what I would say my instrument is, I will say I am an organist. I would not say I am a multi-instrumentalist. And so maybe that's a little ick thing from me, but I just want to know what instrument do you play, because if someone's asking me, are they an accompanist, a multi-instrumentalist probably isn't going to necessarily be able to fulfill that criteria, etc. So I like it to be quite specific. At university, there's a whole identity crisis. And it wasn't just my identity crisis, it was all my peers as well. And bear in mind, this is, going into master's level and upper undergraduate. Are you a performer, a composer, a multi-instrumentalist, a musician, a creative, an artist, a sonic installation artist? What do you do? Who are you? How do you categorize yourself? This is really interesting because I never thought about it. It took me to get to the end of university to be around people that were having conversations that there was a possibility that you could be a musician and be more than just a performer. And I thought, gosh, how brainwashed are we? This is crazy. This idea that if you are a pianist, you are not a composer. A composer is a different category of musician. You can't do more than one thing. I think that's changing a little now, though I do recognise that actually in really classical circles in particular, it's definitely not. A pianist is a pianist. A violinist is a violinist. They may dabble in composition, but they wouldn't call themselves a composer. But a composer, that's a serious endeavour in itself. How does this work with elitism? Well, I'll tell you, for me, it kind of dissipated. And there's this, university identity crisis, but it wasn't really an identity as in whole person identity. It was a creative identity crisis of, what do I call myself? Is that going to impact the sort of work I can do? If I call myself a composer, will an agency not want me because I'm not, a pianist, and they're selling a pianist as a musician, not a composer or a multi-instrumentalist or a creator there, And so it was very much led by employability. And then realising, oh, well, I can, market myself slightly differently in different contexts. But ultimately, you do have to choose. I then moved into church music. And oh my goodness, is this idea of elitism real? I don't think it actually is real, but the value that it receives is very real. Being in church music specifically is the first time that I have come across elitism so directly. Some of it is connected to the way in which we view outreach programs. Some of it is to do with the types of schools that musicians that dominate church music are coming out of, and sort of historical competition. And so that's why it was really interesting when I received this response from my colleague: yes, I am elitist because it ensures quality. Because in my experience, the school that somebody went to, you hope, is an indicator of success measures as an adult. However, I think now, so more than ever, it is not usually an indicator of competence, and therefore is not a fair measure of something being elite. So, as someone who's a director of music, I mean, I work in church music, I've been in church music for nearly 10 years now. I think it's perhaps struck me more than it would somebody else, because I wasn't a chorister when I was growing up. You know, that wasn't, I was conservative evangelical churches, which was not, you know, cathedral music, etc. So anything that I've learnt about church music, I've learnt by proactively seeking out the information, for good or for bad, as opposed to absorbing it because I'm around it. However, I still see lots of the interactions that come up between people with as being really strange. So, you know, I have a music production degree, which is sonic installation arts, it's recording, it's sampling, it's studio. That is absolutely not in church music. However, there's people that are in church music who record. I mean, there's, you know, YouTube channels and all sorts of people recording all sorts of things. And if I was asking a colleague that worked in the broader music industry a question, oh, which DAW, digital audio workspace, are you using? I would just get a direct answer of, oh, I'm using Logic, oh, I'm using Pro Tools, whatever they're using. There wouldn't be an assumption that somebody else didn't know. However, in church music, there's always the assumption that the start point is different. The start point is, I know something that you don't know. And now everybody likes to believe that, but actually, when you first meet someone, you have no idea what they know. So it's quite silly. And it doesn't really translate outside of church music. So as we look to September, you know, we're in this lull. It's May now, mid-May. We're entering into a lull of summer. You know, get to the end of term, and then there'll be the summer term off, and you know, we'll start planning for September loosely at this point. And I'm very much speaking for myself in this planning too. What are we doing that is propelling forward this idea of elitism proactively? So never mind just circumstantially, but proactively, what are we doing that is propelling forward this idea of elitism in church music, which is completely bizarre because it's church. So it kind of goes against everything that the church is and that it represents. And I asked myself the same question because over the last decade of my time in church music, looking at data, I would say at this point, my view on elitism. To be elite is to be set apart from a mass. And I would say in church music, we have no mass, which renders this idea of elitism completely useless. Because there could be some fantastic church musicians that are completely undiscovered because we have this belief that only quality is going to exist in one area. But those areas are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, this we know. So I would just like to end with that thought. To be elite is to be set apart from a mass. Church music, we have no mass. Seize the day.